Hi, my name is Jess. Welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk just about the books I've been reading recently. So I've read 14 books so far this year, but I've got a little reading tracker in my journal. So I've done actually really well for reading books that I enjoyed. Let me just check. So I've got 3 books that I read were 3 star, 5 books were 4 stars, and 6 books were 5 stars. The first book I read this year was The Stolen Heir by Holly Black, which is the first book in a sequel series to The Folk of the Air, which starts with The Cruel Prince. And I can't remember the other 2. So it's like that was a trilogy, and now this is like a separate duology about characters who are mentioned in those books, as well as some cameo appearances from the main characters. The Stolen Heir, I gave 5 stars. The sequel, which is The Prisoner's Throne, I only gave 3 stars. I loved The Stolen Heir. I thought it was amazing. The second book I thought I didn't enjoy it. The fantasy duologies I've read recently, I tend to love the first book, and the first book is always like a 5-star read for me, and then the second book I feel like really lets it down, and it's only like a 3 or 4 star. The Shepherd King series by Rachel Gillig. That first book I loved. I reread it, it was amazing. I really couldn't recommend it highly enough if you're a fan of romantic fantasy, where the fantasy and the romantic elements like very equal. Like there's a plot separate to the romance, but the romance very much informs the plot, and it's just, you know, there's so much longing, and it's slow burn, and it's just like a really romantic fantasy story, but it's not a romance, it's a fantasy. Anyway, I loved The Shepherd King. So the first book is One Dark Window, and I loved it. The second book is Two Twisted Crowns, and we have different main characters for the second book, and I just really loved the main character in the first one, so I think it lost points with me just on not in the, like, my favourite character just wasn't really in the second book, and also I felt like the romance sort of overpowered the second book, and it's a different romance to the first book, and I just wasn't a huge fan of those characters, so I cared less about their romance. So I felt like the second book didn't really live up to the first one. Although I have heard a lot of different opinions, and I have heard like a lot of people whose videos I've watched on BookTube have really enjoyed the second one. So I think it's just personal taste. Also Divine Rivals, I can't remember who the author is. Is it Rebecca Ross? Is Rebecca Ross the author of Divine Rivals? But the first book, I think it's probably a 4 star. I didn't love it as much, but I really enjoyed the romance. I thought it was really cute. I loved the longing. I loved the slow burn. It was just adorable. And then the second book, again, we're following slightly different characters, and they're characters I just don't care about. Also, one character got a really odd redemption arc that I felt like he did not deserve at all, and I just wasn't a fan of that. And I was just I didn't love it as much as the first one. And then the Stolen Heir series, I love the first book. The second book, not so much. So I read both The Stolen Heir and The Prisoner's Throne in January. I also read Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones, which is not the first time I read it. I've read it many times. I think this one, I read the audiobook. I have 2 copies of the actual paperback. My friend got me one, and then I got another one because I really loved the cover. And then I also read the audiobook from Libby, which is a library app where you can read ebooks and audiobooks that you download from your library, so it's free. So I really recommend Libby if you aren't already using it. I liked the audiobook less than the act of reading the paperback. Well, the specific audiobook that I read, I wasn't a huge fan of the voice. If you haven't read Howl's Moving Castle, and you only know the Ghibli film, in the book Howl is Welsh, and the Welsh accent really, I think also it's narrated by, they had one female voice narrating all the characters, so hearing Howl with a Welsh female voice, it just threw me off a little bit. But it's just a great book. I think I gave it 5 stars anyway, just because the story is excellent. Also, reading an audiobook of a book that you love is like an interesting experience, because even though I've read Howl's Moving Castle probably, I don't know, either 3 or 4 times, I feel like because I'm quite a quick reader, I tend to skip passages, especially when I'm really in the zone of reading. I kind of skip over stuff. But then when you're listening to an audiobook, you have to listen to every single word. And there's some lines in there that I don't think I've really read before. So it was kind of like reading some of it for the first time because I actually have to listen to everything that happens. But it was such a fun book and I really love it. If you're a fan of cozy fantasy, definitely read House of Castle. If you're a fan of the films, if you just want like a nice book, especially in spring, definitely read House of Castle. It's just fantastic. I think it's also got so many details in it that you only really catch on a reread. Diana Wynne Jones is an excellent writer and she manages to put in so many things that you only really notice when you reread it. And especially House of Castle, the plot is actually like insane. And you've got so many different characters and so many things happen and so many things are foreshadowed that it takes like quite a few reads for you to actually understand all of the pieces and how they're moving together. So it's great. I also read Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie, which this was an audiobook again with Libby. I gave this 4 stars. I've read a couple of Agatha Christie's books before, but I'd never read Death on the Nile. I had watched the film, the Kenneth Branagh one, and I wasn't a huge fan of the film. And it was interesting reading the book and seeing the differences. At the end, I think it must have been December last year, I read Murder on the Orient Express. And again, I'd seen the Kenneth Branagh film, but I'd never read it before. And it was really interesting seeing the differences and like what they kept and what they changed. And also a lot of the characters, I feel like it's interesting seeing how they changed them and maybe changed their motivations, or like the casting was very different to how they're described in the book. And it was just really interesting, I think, reading books that inspired films and like actually seeing what the difference is. So for Death on the Nile, because I watched the film, I knew who did it, but I couldn't remember how they'd done it. So it was quite interesting reading the book being like, I don't understand how they did it because like it's impossible. And I like couldn't remember at all how it happened. So it did feel like I was reading a book that I didn't know the ending to. If you want to read an Agatha Christie book, I would recommend Death on the Nile. The characters are so fun and it was just a really nice time. So I then decided to pick up The Raven Boys, which is the first book in the Raven Cycle series by Maggie Stiefvater, I think. So I heard of these books from watching Carrie Can Read, and she did a whole reading vlog about them, which I think I must have watched a year ago. I think she did that video quite a long time ago, but I saw they were available on Libby, so I checked them out. And I am obsessed. I'm now currently, I think, about halfway through the last book. So these are young adult fantasy books. They're set in, I think, Virginia in America, and it's about, where do you even start with these? So the Raven Boys themselves are students at Agnonby Academy? I think that's what it's called, which is like a really prestigious school for Republican children, basically, like really rich old money boys. And 3 of our main characters are currently students. One character is their friend, who in the first book seems to also be a student. And then there's also a girl who's living in the town, which is sort of, I think it must be quite like a rural, I don't know, like run down and like quite, I don't know, it's interesting how it's described, but she's definitely from a very different economic background to the boys, who are all, or 2 of them are very wealthy and one of them is working really hard to afford his place on a scholarship. So even just like without the fantasy, you've got this talk about privilege and what it means to be privileged and the future that privilege gives you compared to like the future that you have if you don't have those kind of like family help and family standing. And it's just sort of like this really interesting look at this town and these boys and the main character Blue and sort of how they interact with each other. And then you've got the fantasy elements. It's all about dreams and Welsh kings and psychics. I'm not doing a very good job of explaining this at all. If you want to go in for a coherent plot, that's not what these books are. These books are about vibes and they're about character building. Nothing really happens until like the ending of each book, but the whole thing is just the journey and these characters and getting to know them and how, and them growing up, and it's such a beautiful story and the writing is incredible. So at the beginning of the first book, Blue goes with her aunt to basically find out who's going to die that year. They go to a churchyard on a specific day and they see the ghosts of all the people who are going to die in the future year. And Blue can't see the ghosts. Her aunt is a psychic, but Blue isn't. She just has the power to amplify people, like other people's powers, so that's why she's gone along. But she sees a boy as well, like she sees one of the ghosts as a boy, who's a raven boy. He's in the school's uniform and she can talk to him, and the only reason someone who's not psychic can see one of the ghosts is if they're your true love or if you kill them. And Blue has this curse where if she kisses her true love, he'll die. And that ghost tells her his name, and his name is Gansey. And we then meet Gansey, and he is one of the Raven boys, and he is one of our perspectives. And it's just, it's such a great story. I'm enjoying it so much. Each book is just so well written, and the setting is really well described. They're just so immersive. And the characters, I think, are what really drive these books. It's just such an incredible experience. I'd highly recommend. Even if you don't think you would be a fan of these books, I think give them a go anyway. I didn't pick them up at first because I thought this isn't what I'm into at all. I like high fantasy books. I don't like books about like schools, and I'm just not a fan of books about like characters in the main world. But they are incredible. I think definitely give them a go. They're just really probably the top books that I've read this year so far. The next book I read was Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. This was one of my 5-star reads. I have tried to read one of her other books, which was The Once and Future Witches, but I just couldn't get into it at the time. I still have it. I still mean to read it. I had heard good things about Starling House. Then this was also on Libby, so I thought, why not just give it a go? And it was so good. So the setup of Starling House is that there's this house in this town. It's a mining town, so it's got a lot of people suffer from environmental impacts of the mines. So it's not a great town to be in. It's the sort of town that people will drive past very quickly to get out of. It's a town with people living in it, all they really want to do is leave. But there's this one house that no one goes near, and it's all very mysterious. And there's lots of rumours about it. So the person who built the house wrote this story, which is like a fairy tale, this very famous fairy tale, and the main character grew up loving it. And she's always had this fascination with the house and the stories. And then when one day she grew up and tried to put that all behind her. And then the book starts with that changing as she becomes more involved in this house and the mystery surrounding it. And it's just so good. I think the main character really made this book for me. I loved her. She's just trying to do her best. She's not perfect at all. She's a really complicated character. She's kind of horrible. But she really loves her brother, and everything she's doing is for him. And it's just such an interesting look about like sibling relationships. And I really felt for her like the whole time, because I just wanted her to be happy. It's this sort of book where the main character is just suffering for most of it, and you just want her to just be okay. And there is a romance in the book, and that was also great. It's just like those books that you read where you're just reading it and it's just perfect and it's just faultless. I feel like people probably have different opinions, but it was just the sort of book that I really wanted to read, and it just hit everything I could have asked for. I think I just love very gritty, down-to-earth characters just trying to survive, and then also magic and mysteries and really slow burn longing romances that take a really long time to develop, and you really see the two of them like getting to know each other and getting to trust each other, and it's just so cute. I will say it's very there's lots of like bodily fluids, like people vomit a lot and it's kind of disgusting at times. Like there is a lot of fluid happening and it's kind of disgusting, but aside from that it was great. I then read Januaries by Livy Blake, which is a collection of short stories. I originally gave this book 3 stars, but then when I was sort of thinking about it, I then upped it to 4 stars. So Olivia Blake is probably most famous for the Atlas 6. I haven't read them. There's 2, the Atlas 6 and the Atlas Complex. Is that what it's called? I haven't read those. I have read one for My Enemy, which again is a Carrie Can Read recommendation. I kind of liked One for My Enemy, I liked the writing. I got very confused with the plot. I had very conflicted feelings about that one. But I saw that she had a short story collection, and I'm trying to read a lot of short stories at the moment, and so I decided to give it a go. And I really like them. I think there's a big range of stories in there. Some I liked more than others. A lot of them were very interesting. There's some really interesting ideas. Some I would have loved to see as full-length novels. The first book I think was probably one of my favourites. The first story was probably one of my favourites. They're all fantasy. Some of them go more into sci-fi. I would definitely recommend them, actually. Even if you're not necessarily a fan of Olivia Blake, I think those sort of stories where each one is very different. I think also with short stories, if you don't like one, there's always another one. And these ones are all so different. You can not like one, but really like another. And the ideas also are just really interesting. I think Olivia Blake definitely has some really great ideas. I always admired how her brain works and how she could come up with everything. So I definitely loved it. I would definitely recommend. If you're looking for short stories, but also just like a lot of really interesting concepts, and just like some of them I think maybe fell flat, but I think because the ideas are great, and also because they're just short. Like, it doesn't matter whether or not you feel like the story fully explores the concept. I think they're great like jumping off points, and I've been definitely like thinking about a lot of these stories since reading them, and they definitely stayed with me. So I would definitely recommend them. Another short story I read was The Wood at Midwinter by Susanna Clarke. She wrote Jonathan Strange and Miss Norrell, which is great. I love that book, which is about like magicians in Regency England, and it reads a little bit like a textbook because it's got all these footnotes, but I would definitely recommend it. I would also definitely recommend the BBC TV show, but The Wood at Midwinter is a standalone short story. It's just like a novella, really. I think I got this from Libby, though the version I had was illustrated, and the illustrations are amazing. I preferred the illustrations to the story. It's a very quick read. It's only like 30 pages, and most of those are illustrations. It's felt like a book you might read a child, but it was sort of had this darkness to it. It had like talking animals. It had a wood in midwinter, shockingly. I'm really intrigued by the idea, but I feel like I couldn't get into it because it was just too short. It sort of went by too quickly, and I think the idea was so interesting. I want more of it, and I feel like it must have only been like 10 sentences in its entirety. It just went by so quickly. So I feel like I needed more. Obviously, it was just what it was, but I would definitely read it as like even a longer short story. I feel like it needed, or like I just wanted more from it. But like as a story that you're going to tell someone at bedtime, fantastic. I really got into novellas. I think I read A Wood at Midwinter, and then the next book, I think possibly in the same day. The next book I read was Six Deaths of a Saint by Alex E. Harrow. I'd read Starting House, and I just wanted to read more of Alex E. Harrow. Again, this is another recommendation from Carrie Can Read, and it was great. It was short, but it didn't feel that short. It was sort of like the perfect short story where it's explored this idea in a really like concise amount of time, but it felt well-rounded. It felt like you had this full story, even though it's only a novella and it's really short, but it managed to explore all its ideas in a really like thorough way. So I felt like we had a full story, even though it was so short. I just thought it was fantastic. I don't think I'm going to tell you anything about it. It's fantasy. That's it. Yeah. Just read it. You don't need to know anything about it because it tells you what it is in the amount of time it has. It's not going to be what you expect, but it's fantastic. So yeah, one of my top recommendations that I've read so far. The next book I read, this was a historical romance set in the 60s. It was You Should Be So Lucky by Cat Sebastian. This is my first book by Cat Sebastian. I think there's another book that is based off other characters who are involved, and I definitely want to read that as well. I think that's called like We Should Be So something, because this is You Should Be So Lucky and that's We Should Be something, I think. They have similar sounding titles. So You Should Be So Lucky is about a baseball player and a journalist who's been told to write an ongoing column about the baseball player. So there's like a lot of sports journalism. I didn't realise it would be so sport heavy. I have no interest in sports. So some of it I was like struggling to get through because it was like sport. And I was like, well, I don't care about this at all. But I loved the characters and I cared about the characters so deeply. I willingly read about sports, but it was just so sweet. It's really interesting reading a romance book where the romance is illegal and it's like forbidden romance. It was forbidden romance in reality, and I think reading it from like in 2025, when obviously this is fine, it's so interesting reading about this period of time that isn't actually that long ago, and that people lived through and had to like live their lives in secret. And it was just like, it's such an interesting take on a romance novel where you're sort of questioning the whole time, being like, this is just not fair. And it's romance, so it has all of like those tropes that you might consider in a romance book, but also it's got this deep discussion running through it, and it's just also so romantic. It also like dealt with some really interesting themes. A lot about, I know the title is You Should Be So Lucky, but like a lot of it is about luck. And it's just really interesting about like the discussions that the characters have with each other. Like it really delves into like some really interesting themes, and it's got some really interesting takes. So if you want a romance book, particularly that's queer, has quite an interesting like subject, I would definitely recommend You Should Be So Lucky. I also read another book by Olivia Blake, which was Masters of Death. This was kind of an impulse purchase for me. I enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. I definitely will be rereading it just so that I can understand what happened. It's a sort of book where it tells you nothing. You just have to sort of figure it out yourself. So it's quite challenging to get through, because there'll be scenes where you don't know who anyone is because it just won't tell you, and you kind of have to just piece it together. It's a very like involved reading experience because you actually have to put quite a lot of work into figuring out what is going on. So one of the main characters is the godson of death, another is a vampire, and another is a ghost. And the vampire is trying to sell the house that the ghost is haunting. And based on that description, that was the reason I picked it up. And there's actually not a huge amount about actually selling the house. It's more goes into death, the figure, like the personification of death, and what it is to be immortal, and all these different immortal figures. There's gods, there's angels, there's demons, and they all sort of come together to play a game. And actually that is quite an in-depth explanation of what the book is. And if it sounds very vague, yes, that is the experience of reading this book. I would say if you like Olivia Blake's other books, definitely read it. If you also like Piranesi, if you like books where you don't really know what's going on and you do have to kind of put a lot of work into figuring it out, I would definitely recommend Masters of Death. If you enjoy romance where you're not really sure if you should want these two people to be together, and the book sort of takes its time in telling you whether or not you should be rooting for the couple, I definitely pick it up. It is very sweet, even though the characters themselves are not. But yeah, if you want sort of a very like complex romance, there's not even much of a romance in it. It sort of features romance very loosely. If you want a book that really confuses you, read Masters of Death. But it was great. I think I'm going to let it sit with me, and then I'm going to reread it, and then I'm going to hope that on the reread I actually remember all the things, so I don't then have to like reread it again to actually figure out what happened. And finally, the book that I have just finished was Ladies of Grace Adieu. Oh dear. The Ladies of Grace Adieu. The Ladies of Grace Adieu by Susanna Clarke. Again, Susanna Clarke, who wrote A Wood at Midwinter. So this is a collection of short stories. I would say fairy tales is the more accurate description of what they are. Some of them have footnotes, and they are sort of like based from the world that Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is set in. I don't think you necessarily have to read that to understand these books, but I think it would probably definitely help. I feel like you wouldn't necessarily understand a lot of what was happening if you hadn't already had some understanding of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. But I think watch the TV show and then read this, and then you'll be fine. But there were some really lovely stories. Some of them got quite dark. A lot of them I will be thinking about for a long time coming. And there's one particular one where it was left very ambiguous, and I loved it, but I'm really confused. I will be thinking about it for a while and sort of wondering what the takeaway should be, because I think the takeaway I want to have isn't the one that I think has been implied, but I really enjoyed it. And I think the writing style is very old-fashioned. It's very Jane Austen, very Angela Carter. She kind of also reminded me of Daphne du Maurier, that kind of like historic writing, which was really lovely to read. I'm always admired by writers who can sort of emulate that kind of writing style. It's one of the styles that I love reading and I wish I could achieve myself. So yeah, definitely lovely writing. The imagery was excellent. I think the concepts were really interesting. I didn't give it 5 stars. Again, like the stories aren't really long enough to really delve into, but I had a lovely time and I would definitely recommend to read it if you are a fan of Susanna Clarke's other works, particularly Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I think if you've read Piranesi and not her other works, you might not understand a lot of the stories. I think if you're a fan of Emily Wilde and the Encyclopedia of Fairies and that series, then you would definitely love Susanna Clarke. And also I think if you have read Naomi Novik, I think you would also enjoy these as well. So those are all the books that I read this year so far, in the last 2 months. Thank you for sitting with me if you're still here. If you would like to see more of me, please subscribe. And thank you for watching. Hopefully I'll see you again soon.